By the time the maid touched his face, the room had already been turned into a freezer. The boss of Boston's Italian underworld had no pulse and anyone could find. No visible breath, and skin so cold it felt like carved stone. The doctors had called it. The captains were already splitting his empire like wolves around fresh meat. But while the men downstairs argued over money, ports, and murder, one woman everybody in that mansion laughed at made a decision that would terrify all of them by sunrise. She climbed onto the steel table beside the dead man. And before dawn, the dead man opened his eyes. His name was Dante Morelli, at 35. Dante ruled the Boston waterfront with the kind of quiet violence that made louder men look childish. He did not scream, he did not posture, he did not need to. The trucking routes, the private gambling rooms, the longshore unions, the politicians who smiled too brightly at charity dinners and answered burner phones in their garages. They all bent around him. He wore charcoal suits that looked simple until you learned they cost more than most people's rent. And he had a habit of listening in complete silence until the person across from him started talking themselves into a grave. In the granite and glass Morelli estate overlooking the black winter water north of the city, dozens of people worked for him and almost none of them really existed in his eyes. Except one. Her name was Beatrice Doyle, B to her sister. Miss Doyle if anyone was feeling unusually polite, which they rarely were. She was 29 years old, 5'3", and close to 300 pounds, heavy in the way cruel people noticed first and humanity noticed last. She cleaned guest rooms, carried laundry bundles bigger than suitcases, polished floors, hauled kitchen stock, and did the jobs the slimmer maids found reasons to avoid. The younger house girls whispered when she passed. The men in tailored jackets smirked openly. One of Dante's soldiers once called her the Avalanche when she struggled to lift a crate of imported wine. Another said, "Careful, she drank the inventory too." The kitchen staff laughed. B laughed too, because sometimes that was easier than bleeding in public. But Dante Morelli did not laugh, 3 months before the night he died. B had been carrying a silver breakfast service through the West Corridor when Dante's underboss, Vincent Caruso, stuck out a polished shoe and clipped her ankle. It was neat, calculated, humiliating. B went down hard. The tray exploding across Italian marble and a crash of porcelain. Fruit and tea. Hot liquid drenched her uniform. A strawberry rolled to the toe of Vincent's shoe while the men around him laughed like schoolboys. Then the hallway went silent. Dante had stepped out of his study. He took in the broken tray, the scalded maid on the floor, and Vincent standing over her with that smug little smile men wear when they think cruelty makes them look powerful. Dante didn't raise his voice. "Pick her up." Vincent blinked. "Dante. I know exactly what you were doing." Dante's tone turned colder. "Pick her up, apologize." "Then get on your knees and clean the tea off my floor before she does." Nobody moved. That was when Dante took one step forward. It was amazing what one step from the right man could do. Vincent bent immediately, hauled B upright with visible disgust, muttered an apology that sounded like glass in his throat, and then, while the whole corridor watched, got down on his knees and wiped the mess with a linen napkin. Dante never looked at him again. He only glanced at B long enough to say, "Go change. Burn that uniform." It was the first time in years anyone with power had used it to protect her instead of entertain themselves. B never forgot it, and that was why, on the night every doctor in the house gave up on Dante Morelli, she was the only one who refused to leave him cold. It happened in a storm. The kind of January storm that made the harbor look like black oil and turned every streetlight into a smear of pale gold in the snow. Dante had gone to a shipyard office in South Boston to settle a dispute over a container that should never have cleared customs. It was supposed to be routine. 10 minutes, 2 signatures, 1 warning. Instead, the lights cut out halfway through the meeting. The first shot took Dante in the lower abdomen. The second shattered the glass behind him. The third never should have happened, which meant the betrayal had started before the shooting did. Somebody on the inside had given the gunman his route, the room layout, and the exact minute he would step away from his bodyguards. Dante still killed one of them before he hit the floor. By the time his men got him back to the estate, he was pale, semi-conscious, and soaked in enough blood to make even seasoned killers avert their eyes. The mansion's lower level had been converted years earlier into a private trauma suite for exactly this reason. No public hospital, no police questions, no paper trail. Just discreet medicine for indecent men, doctor. Julian Sorrel was already scrubbed in when they brought Dante through the steel doors. Sorrel had once been a brilliant trauma surgeon at Mass General, before gambling debts and narcotics swallowed the respectable version of his life. Now he patched bullet wounds for monsters, and billed more than any hospital ever could. He cut Dante's shirt away, barked orders for blood, opened the abdominal wound, and stopped cursing only long enough to realize something was wrong. The bleeding didn't make sense, the heart rhythm didn't make sense, and the temperature definitely didn't make sense. Dante's blood pressure kept collapsing, but not the way Sorrel expected from blood loss alone. His muscles went slack, his pupils widened. His breathing slowed to thin, miserable pulls that barely fogged the oxygen mask. Then his pulse became so faint one nurse swore it was gone, only for the monitor to flicker weakly a second later. His skin cooled at a frightening speed. Sorrel stared at the wound and saw a faint chemical sheen around torn tissue. Poison, not the cinematic kind that killed instantly. Something smarter, something designed to silence nerve signals and suffocate a man from the inside while making it look like trauma finished the job. A sodium channel blocker, Sorrel muttered, voice tightening. The kind of lab-built toxin that could drag the diaphragm toward paralysis, slow the heart into a whisper, and leave a body looking dead long before it actually crossed the line. Can you reverse it? One of Dante's captains demanded. Sorrel didn't answer because he didn't have one. There was no antidote waiting in a silver case. Only support, ventilation, warm fluids, time, luck. And Dante Morelli was running out of all four. By midnight his heartbeat was barely a stutter. The room felt too cold because Sorrel had dropped the ambient temperature to preserve tissue. Once he became convinced the end was near, one nurse suggested continuing ventilation longer. Another said she still thought she felt something at the carotid. Sorrel checked himself, fingers pressed to Dante's neck. Eyes on the monitor. Nothing reliable. He checked again. Still nothing. But he was checking like a man in panic. Not like a man being careful in severe hypothermia and poisoning. A pulse could hide in the body like a secret. It could be too slow to catch unless you waited. Too faint to trust unless you were patient. There was an old rule in emergency medicine that said no one was dead until they were warm and dead. Julian Sorrel knew that rule. At 12:11 a.m., he ignored it. He stripped off one bloody glove, looked at the wall clock, and said the words that changed the next 6 hours of everyone's life. Time of death. 12:11. Silence hit the room harder than the gunshots had. Then everything moved at once. The four lines were disconnected. Instruments were dropped into trays. A white sheet was pulled over Dante's face. The cooling system in the surgical suite was lowered further to hold the body until dawn, when a loyal mortuary crew could remove him without press or police attention. And outside those steel doors, the empire began to rot before the body was even cold. Vincent Caruso took command with indecent speed. He started in the corridor. Orders, keys, phones. Security teams reassigned. Armory sealed, accounts frozen, 2 captains disarmed. 3 more bought with promises of territory. By 1:30 in the morning, the cigar room upstairs sounded less like a wake and more like a board meeting hosted by vultures. Whiskey, cigars, quiet threats, men pretending grief while calculating profit. Dante Morelli had not yet been dead 2 hours. And already they were trying on his crown. Bea heard it all from the service hallway. She was carrying fresh glasses nobody noticed when Vincent brushed past her and said to another captain, "By sunrise, every man in this city will know who's in charge." That was the moment something inside her hardened. Not because Dante was a saint, he wasn't. Bea knew exactly what kind of man he was. She had heard screams through closed doors, seen bruised knuckles, blood on cuffs, lawyers arriving after midnight. But in a house full of elegant cruelty, He had once done a simple thing no one else had bothered to do. He had seen her. And now he was alone in the cold while jackals climbed over each other downstairs. At 2:07 a.m., B stole a keycard from an unattended station, slipped down the servant's staircase, and entered the medical wing. The cold hit first. It was vicious, mechanical. The kind of cold with no weather in it, no wind, no snow. Just sterile refrigeration meant for flesh that no longer mattered. The suite hummed softly. The overhead lights were dimmed. Machines sat black and silent in the center of the room. Beneath a bank of white surgical lamps lay a man who had once made a room full of killers stop talking just by standing up. Bey approached slowly. Her hands were shaking before she even touched the sheet. "Mr. Morelli," she whispered, then flinched at how wrong the title sounded now. She folded back the cloth. Dante looked unreal. His lips held a faint bluish tint. His skin had taken on that pale, waxed stillness that scared people more than blood did. Fresh dressings wrapped his abdomen and shoulder. Damp hair lay across his forehead. His chest was bare above the bandages. Motionless beneath the cold light, Bee pressed her fingers to his cheek. Ice. A sob tore out of her before she could stop it. "No," she whispered. "No. Not like this." She looked around the room as if help might be hiding in the cabinets. Nobody. Nothing. Just the hum of cooling air, and the quiet body of the only man in that mansion who had ever humiliated the people who humiliated her. Bee had worked briefly at a nursing home before coming to the estate. Long nights, old bodies, bad heating. A retired paramedic once told her something after a winter power outage when they were trying to keep 3 elderly residents warm with blankets and body heat. "Cold lies, sweetheart," he'd said. "Don't trust cold." The memory flashed through her so sharply it made her dizzy. Dante shouldn't have felt this cold this fast. That thought was irrational. Grief makes everything irrational. But once it arrived, it wouldn't leave. She touched his chest, still freezing. The room was turning him into an object, and suddenly Bee couldn't bear it. Not after the blood, not after the corridor. Not after the way those men upstairs were already erasing him. So she did the only thing her heart would let her do. She kicked off her shoes, climbed onto the steel table with awkward, desperate determination, and eased her heavy body down beside him. The metal groaned under her weight. She pulled the sheet over both of them, pressed herself against his side, and wrapped her arms around him as tightly as she could without disturbing the bandages. One of her legs hooked over his to trap what little warmth remained. She tucked his head beneath her chin. He felt like winter. She felt like the last stove in a dead house. "It's okay," she whispered, tears wetting his hair. "You don't get to be alone. Not tonight." Minutes passed, then an hour. Bee climbed down only long enough to raid the linen warmer in the adjacent prep room. She brought back heated blankets, thermal pads, and towels still faintly warm from the cabinet, and layered them over Dante's torso. Under his neck, around his sides. Then she noticed the cooling vent pushing refrigerated air across the room. She found the wall controls, walked, she swore, waddled into the supply closet, dragged a metal stool across the tile, and with trembling fingers yanked the emergency maintenance panel open. 2 tries later, she killed the cooling unit. The room stopped blowing death at him. Then she climbed back up beside him and kept holding on. At 3:41 a.m., something happened. It was so small she almost missed it. Bee had shifted, trying to ease a cramp from her hip. When the side of her face brushed Dante's chest, she went still, held her breath, pressed her ear harder against the skin above his heart. Nothing. Then thump, so faint it could have been a muscle twitch. A lie, wishful thinking dressed as hope. Bee didn't move. She counted in her head. 32, 33, 34, at 58 seconds. She heard it again thump. Her entire body went rigid. "No," she breathed. Except this time the word meant the opposite. She pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck and forced herself to wait. Not 5 seconds, not 10. She waited as long as fear would allow. There, a thread of life, thin, slow, buried deep. Dante Morelli was not dead. He was trapped somewhere horrifyingly close to it. Bee's first instinct was to run for help. Her second was better. Because the only men awake in the house were Vincent Caruso's men. And if Vincent learned Dante was still alive before Dante could defend himself, this night would end with a second death that no doctor could mistake. So Bee shut the suite door, locked it, and went back to work. She kept him horizontal. She kept him warm. She changed the blankets as they cooled, when his breathing stretched too far apart. She bent close and counted until the next shallow pull rasped past his lips. Twice she thought it had stopped altogether and nearly screamed. Instead she rubbed his sternum, whispered his name, and laid herself over him again, sharing every ounce of heat her body could make. By 4:30 sweat soaked her hairline despite the lingering chill in the room. By 5, the blue at his lips had begun to fade. By 5:15, the pulse in his neck was still weak, but no longer vanishing for entire eternities. And that should have been the miracle. But the truly dangerous part came next. Because just before 6 in the morning, while Bee was replacing a towel at Dante's shoulder, the keycard reader outside the suite chimed. She froze, voices Vincent Caruso and Dr. Sorrell. "They should have moved him already," Vincent snapped. "Open the damn door." The lock clicked. Bee barely had time to turn before the door swung inward and the two men strode in, followed by a pair of armed soldiers and a black body bag folded under one guard's arm. Vincent stopped dead. For one suspended second. Nobody in the room understood what they were seeing. The fat maid, hair hanging loose, uniform half open at the collar, face flushed, blankets everywhere, sitting on the surgical table beside the corpse she was supposed to have left alone. Then Dante inhaled. It was not elegant, it was not gentle. It was a harsh, tearing, predatory drag of air that ripped through the room like someone had fired a shot inside a chapel. Everyone stared. Dante's chest rose. His back arched, his hand twitched against the sheet. Then his eyes opened, bloodshot, fever-bright, furious. Vincent made a sound no ambitious man ever wants witnesses to hear. A small, involuntary gasp of animal fear. "That's impossible," Sorrell whispered. Dante's gaze moved slowly, painfully, until it locked on Vincent. In that instant, Vincent knew exactly what Dante had understood. The ambush had not been a rival crew's lucky hit. It had been an inside job. Vincent's right hand vanished inside his jacket. Bee saw it first. "Dante!" she cried. Vincent drew a suppressed pistol and raised it with a shaking hand. "You were supposed to stay dead." Dante tried to push himself upright. But his body was still sluggish with cold and poison. He got halfway up, face tightening in pain. Then stalled, too weak, too slow. Vincent took aim. And Bee launched herself off the table. There are moments when physics stop caring about dignity. This was one of them. All of Bee's weight, all of her terror. All of the shame she had swallowed in that mansion for months slammed into Vincent Caruso at once. She hit him square in the chest before he could fire. The impact drove him backward into a stainless steel cart that flipped under them in an explosion of clamps, gauze and metal trays. The pistol went off once, the shot punching harmlessly into the ceiling. Vincent hit the floor hard. Bee landed on top of him harder. He cursed, thrashed, clawed at her shoulders. But panic makes strong people sloppy and desperate people terrifying. Bee jammed her forearm across his throat, seized his gun wrist with both hands, and smashed it against the tile until his fingers spasmed open. The pistol skittered away under a cabinet. "You stupid cow!" Vincent wheezed, bucking under her. Bee didn't answer. She was past embarrassment now. Past self-consciousness. Past every ugly little comment men had ever tossed at her like scraps. She bore down with everything she had, pinning him to the floor as he twisted and choked beneath her. One of Vincent's guards stepped forward. But Dante's voice stopped him. "Move," Dante rasped. "And I'll blind you before breakfast," the guard froze. Nobody in that room understood how a half-dead man lying on a surgical table could still sound like that. But they believed him, doctor. Sorrell looked from Vincent choking under Bee's weight to Dante hauling himself upright on one elbow. He had exactly 1 second to decide which man would still own the city by noon. He chose correctly. Sorrel bent, grabbed the fallen pistol, and without a word placed it in Dante's hand. Vincent saw it and started begging before the barrel even found him. Dante, listen to me. It was business. They said you were weak. They said after Atlantic Avenue, after the unions. After I trusted you, Dante said. He was sitting up now, barely, the sheet pulled at his waist. One bandaged hand pressed to his side. He looked like death dragged upright by spite. His face was colorless, his voice was ruined. And somehow he had never seemed more dangerous. Bea finally pushed herself off Vincent and stumbled back. Breathing in ragged bursts, Vincent rolled, coughed, tried to crawl. Dante lifted the pistol. You betrayed me, he said quietly. Then you left me in the cold. And after she kept me alive with her bare hands, you pointed a gun at her in my house. Vincent went still. Dante's eyes flicked once toward Bea. Unforgivable. The suppressed shot sounded small. Vincent Caruso collapsed against the cabinet and did not move again. Nobody else in the room seemed to breathe. Then Dante lowered the gun, his strength failing as abruptly as it had returned. Sorrel rushed forward on instinct, caught him before he slid from the table, and started shouting for warm saline, ventilatory support, monitors, blood. Anyone still loyal enough to answer. By the time the sun rose over the harbor, the Morelli estate belonged to Dante again. Not because his men loved him, because fear recovered faster than grief. The captains who had been swearing loyalty to Vincent at 3 a.m. arrived in the medical suite at 7 with pale faces and trembling hands. Dante, propped up in bed, skin finally warming, listened to each excuse with dead eyes. Some men were stripped of rank. 2 disappeared before nightfall. 1 was found in the trunk of his own Mercedes at Logan. The house learned very quickly that the boss had returned from the edge of death in a terrible mood. But the strangest change in the mansion had nothing to do with punishment. It had to do with Bea at noon. After the bleeding was controlled and the poison had lost enough of its grip for Dante to speak without gasping, he asked for her. She came in expecting to be scolded. She was still in the same wrinkled uniform, hair hastily tied back, cheeks burning with the memory of what she had done. She had tackled an underboss, lain in a bed with a corpse that wasn't a corpse, and spent the morning trying not to think about the moment Dante's eyes had opened while her arms were wrapped around him. Dante dismissed everyone else from the room. For a moment there was only the hum of the heater, the distant crash of winter waves below the bluff, and Bea standing near the door wishing she were invisible again. You stayed, Dante said. His voice was raw but steadier now. Bea looked down. I couldn't leave you there. Everyone else did. She had no answer to that. Dante studied her for a long time. Not the cruel up and down glance she knew too well, not the embarrassed, hurried look men used when they wanted to pretend they weren't noticing her size. He looked at her the way a survivor looks at the last light in a blackout. Sorrel told me what happened, he said. The toxin slowed my heart, the cold buried it. He should have checked longer, he knows that, but you... Dante's expression shifted, something fierce softening at the edges. You shut off the cooling system. Brought heat. Stayed on the table all night so my body wouldn't lose what little fight it had left. Bea swallowed hard. I just didn't want you to be cold. That hit him harder than the bullets. She saw it happen. Dante looked away for one brief second, like a man recovering from a blow no one else in the room could see. When I had power, he said slowly, men obeyed me. When I had money, they praised me. When they thought I was dead, they abandoned me before the hour was over. His eyes came back to hers. You stayed when I had nothing left to offer you but silence and cold skin. Bea's throat tightened. I'm not. She gave a shaky laugh that turned almost immediately into tears. I'm not one of those women who belong in rooms like this, Dante frowned. What women? She gestured helplessly at everything. The heated suite, the estate above them. His world, thin women, beautiful women. Women who look right next to a man like you. Dante stared at her as if she had just said the stupidest thing he had ever heard in his life. Beatrice. Nobody had ever said her full name like it mattered. The only person who looked right next to me last night, he said, was the woman who kept my heart alive until morning. Her eyes filled completely then. Dante reached out, slow because every movement still hurt, and held out his hand after one trembling second. Bea crossed the room and let him take hers. His fingers were warm now. That mattered more than it should have. You think I want another polished ornament in designer silk? He asked quietly. Another cold-faced socialite who'd cry over my coffin and sleep perfectly fine the next night? No, I have met enough beautiful cowards to last several lifetimes. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. I want the woman who saw a body everyone else gave up on, and said not yet. Bea made a broken sound that was half laugh, half sob. Dante pulled her closer. He was still weak, still bruised, still attached to lines and monitors. But when he looked up at her, there was nothing uncertain in his face. You saved my life, he murmured. And for the first time in a very long time. That makes me feel something more frightening than death. What? Gratitude, he said, then, after the briefest pause. And something worse. Bea's pulse kicked. Dante's hand slid gently to the soft curve of her waist, not hiding it, not apologizing for it. Not pretending it wasn't there, honoring it. Like the truth itself lived under his palm. When I was freezing, he said, voice dropping lower. Your body was the only place in this world that still felt like home. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the movies Bea had cried through alone in the servant quarters. It wasn't polished or theatrical. It was slow because he was hurt. Reverent because he knew exactly what she had given him. And hungry in a way that made years of humiliation start cracking apart inside her chest. For once in her life, Bea did not try to make herself smaller. She didn't suck in her stomach. Didn't angle her body away. Didn't hide. And Dante Morelli kissed her like a man who had seen the gates of hell open. Looked back, and chosen her instead. By spring, the city had a new story to whisper. Not just that Dante Morelli had survived a night every doctor had given up on. Not just that Vincent Caruso had betrayed him and died for it. But that the woman who saved the boss wasn't a mistress smuggled in through a side door, or some immaculate heiress in diamonds. It was the maid, the big one. The one people mocked until they realized she now sat at Dante's right hand during private dinners and charity galas. Dressed not to hide her body, but to command the room with it. The one staff members addressed with trembling respect. The one Dante consulted on household decisions. Then business decisions, then far more than that. She had a mind for people, a nose for lies. And a memory for every insult ever spoken in the estate. She used all three, and in the mansion itself. A law took shape without ever being written down. No one laughed at Beatrice Doyle again. Because sometimes, the men who look unstoppable are one cold room away from disappearing forever. And sometimes the person who drags them back is the one the whole world dismissed as too soft. Too heavy, too ordinary to matter. But that was the lie, wasn't it? Soft is not weak, warm is not small. And on the longest night of Dante Morelli's life, the only thing stronger than poison, bullets. And betrayal was the woman who refused to let him go cold. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Bea's place. Your support helps us bring more emotional mafia stories every week. Your support helps us bring more and more emotional mafia stories every week.